Who is the bigger threat to democracy? Is it China or is it the United States? If you listen to the Western media, the answer seems clear. It has to be China. China is expanding or exporting its authoritarian model to the rest of the world. And it's up to America and its allies to protect and defend democracy. So the media tells us. It's a battle or a contest between West and East, democracy and dictatorship.
But there appears to be a growing contest between authoritarianism and liberalism right now.
In the battle between democracy and autocracies.
Putin's kleptocracy, kleptocracy, and the guys who are the kleptocracies.
But does the rest of the world agree? Do they see the United States as a protector of democracy and China as a threat? Or do they see things differently? Today we're going to find out. The answer may surprise you. Hello everyone. Today we're going to find out who is the bigger threat to democracy. Is it China or is it the United States? This map will give you the answer. The color blue means that people in that country consider the United States to be the main threat to their democracy. The color red means the opposite. It means that the people in that country consider China to be the main threat to their democracy or to their political system. Now, as you can see, the map is very blue, which means that most of the world actually sees the United States to be the main threat. Now you may wonder, why should we care about this? Well, I think you should care, because Western people have been lied into a war before. Now, if we all remember Iraq, with the story about WMD and later with the story about the United States trying to create a democratic system in Iraq. Well, politicians are lying to us again. What they are doing is they are presenting a story to us in which the United States is the world's defender of democracy and China is the main threat. So in this story, countries around the world, they look up to the United States and they are asking the United States to help them to defend against the Chinese threat. But as you can see on this map, it's actually not the case. Most countries in the world consider the United States to be the main threat. So let's have a look at this map in a little bit more detail. But before we do, it's important to know where this information comes from. So this map is based on the results of a study called the Democracy Perception Index of 2021. And this study was conducted by a German organization called Latana in collaboration with the Alliance of Democracies, which is a non-profit organization that is actually linked to NATO, because a former NATO Secretary General founded the Alliance of Democracies. So it's important to know that there are two Western organizations behind this study, and they have no reason to be favorable to China. So let's return to the map and let's have a look at some regions and try to explain why countries either consider the United States or China as the main threat. So if we zoom in to Southeast Asia, what you see is that there are several countries that consider China to be the main threat. Now, Vietnam, which is this country, and Malaysia, which is this country, they are red, which means that they consider China to be the main threat to their democratic system. Now, why is this? Well, there are several reasons. One reason is that it's kind of natural for small countries to be concerned with their much bigger and more powerful neighbors. So for countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, to be concerned about China is only natural. But there are also other reasons, and one reason has to do with the South China Sea, which is the region around here, which is very important for world trade. It's also very important to China, because a lot of the oil that China imports is carried by ship, and actually these ships, they pass through the South China Sea towards China. And also many things that China exports leaves China by ship and sail through the South China Sea to Europe and Africa and other places. So what has been happening in this sea, in the South China Sea, is that China has tried to increase its control over it. Now there are several islands in the South China Sea. Many countries claim those islands. Not only China is claiming those islands, but also Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan. And what most of the countries are doing is they're also putting military installations on these islands. And this has resulted in a very dangerous and sometimes tense standoff between all these different countries. And China has been the most busy. They've been creating islands, in fact. They have turned rocks into full-scale military bases. And many countries are concerned about this, and that may also be a reason why countries like Vietnam and Malaysia and also the island of Taiwan are concerned about China's intentions and China's actions. Now, another country that is concerned about China, that sees China as the main threat to its democratic system, is Australia, which is this country. The reason here is, I think, more straightforward, because Australia has been firmly aligned with the United States against China. And if you read the Australian media, you'll see that they are quite negative towards China. And they're very favorable in general to the United States when it comes to this new Cold War between the United States and China. So it makes sense that Australians are more concerned about China than the United States. Now, if we move to another region, you will see some very interesting results. So this is the Middle East and Africa. So here's Africa and this is the Middle East. And what you see is that there's a mix between red and blue. And to focus first on the blue countries, it's very interesting because the Middle East and Africa have been major destinations for Chinese investment, mostly under the Belt and Road Initiative. And this giant Chinese project of investment and construction of infrastructure in countries in Africa and the Middle East has been presented by the Western media as a new form of colonialism. And the way it is talked about is that countries in Africa are very concerned about what China is doing, and it's maybe up to the United States to help these countries defend against the expansion of Chinese authoritarianism. But if you look at the map, what you in fact see is that quite a few countries, for instance Nigeria, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, even Saudi Arabia, they are mostly concerned about the United States being a threat to their democratic system. So this means that this story about African people being highly concerned about Chinese rise is in fact a little bit misleading, because they're even more concerned about US intentions in the region. Now, there are two countries that are highly interesting when it comes to how they see China. So one of them is the country of Iran, which is this country. So it considers China to be the main threat to its political system. And this is very interesting because, as we know, the United States has a very long history of interfering in the politics of Iran. So if you go back, for instance, to 1953, which is a major event, the United States, together with Britain, overthrew the democratically elected leader of Iran and replaced him with a dictator, also known as the Shah of Iran. He ruled Iran for about 26 years until 1979, and he was a very pro Western figure. He was very loyal towards the United States, and the United States supported him with a very large military and also with the secret police, which helped the Shah to remain in power. Well, this ended in 1979, and from that time onwards, Iran has been almost enemy number one for the United States. And the United States has tried to overthrow Iranian governments and replace it with a more pro-Western one, mainly using economic warfare, so economic sanctions, which have been quite devastating to Iran's economy. And they are continuing this day, these economic sanctions. But still, Iran somehow, for some reason, considers China to be the main threat. And the most likely explanation actually has to do with increased Chinese presence in Iran. Because in 2021, you had a major investment deal between China and Iran, worth about $400 billion, which is a lot. And this is actually the same year that the study was conducted. And there's another study which looks at what Iranians think about this major trade deal with China. And this study asked several very interesting questions. One of them is about if Iran expands its trade relations with China, China will start influencing Iran's foreign policy. This question was put to the Iranian people, and 48% agreed. They thought that if Iran would increase its economic relations with China, then China may start to influence Iran's foreign policy. Now, they also asked this about domestic policy. And about 44% thought that if Iran would increase its economic relations with China, then China would start to influence Iran's domestic political system, which may be a very good explanations for why Iranians are kind of concerned about China. Because this trade deal was conducted in the same year as this study was being conducted. Now, if you move to Kenya, as you can see, it's also red, so it means it sees China as the main threat to its democratic or political system. And I think here the reason may be very similar to Iran, because Kenya has been a very important destination for a lot of Chinese investments. And the increased presence of China in Kenya may be very concerning to people. They may realize that there are also benefits to increased trade and investment with and from China. But they also know, and I think they would be correct to think that if Chinese interest in Kenya go up, then China may also start to interfere in some of its political decisions and its political system. But the important thing to take away, I think, from looking at Africa and the Middle East is that actually most countries consider the United States to be the main threat to their political system. They may also be concerned about China, but that's not their main concern. Now let's look at another region which is Latin America. Now people who know the history of this region, they will not be surprised to see that this is mostly blue, which means that most countries consider the United States to be the main threat to their democratic system. And the reason why I say this is that the United States has a very long history of interfering in those countries. So the list is very long, but some of the most famous examples is US overthrow of the democratic government of Guatemala in 1954, a US-supported coup that overthrew the democratic government of Brazil in 1964 and replaced it with a military dictatorship, a US-supported coup in Chile in 1973 that also brought to power a dictator, and another major event was a failed US attempt to overthrow the democratic government of Venezuela in 2002. Which actually brings us to a very interesting case, which is Venezuela, because according to this study, the Venezuelan people consider China to be the main threat to their democratic system. And this is somewhat surprising, perhaps to some, including to myself when I first saw this, but there may be a very reasonable explanation for this. So it's important to know that US interference in Venezuela's political system goes all the way back to, well, at least 1908, when the president of Venezuela traveled to Germany to get medical treatment, and while he was away, you had a military general who seized power. The legitimate president, who was still in Germany, when he tried to quickly go back to Venezuela, his return was blocked by the US Navy. And the reason is that the United States thought that this military general who had seized power would be very good to US interest, specifically very good to US oil corporations. And they were correct, because this military general, who established a military dictatorship in Venezuela, he opened up the oil industry to the United States, which then became dominated by two giant US oil corporations, and also a Royal Dutch Shell, which is a British and Dutch oil corporation. Now, US interference in Venezuela's political system continued. The United States supported one other dictatorship in the 1940s and 1950s, which was actually very brutal. But if you fast forward to the rise of Hugo Chavez in 1999, the United States was faced with a government under Chavez who did not go along with US interest. And the United States has tried to overthrow that government several times. One of them was the failed coup in 2002. But there was also an economic war, and when Hugo Chavez died and was succeeded by Maduro, US attempts continued, again with a failed coup attempt, this time by Juan Guaido, and also continued economic warfare, which continues to this day. So for the Venezuelan people, having experienced all of this and know about all of this, to still consider China as the main threat looks a little bit odd. But I think there's a reasonable explanation, because the Venezuelan society is quite split. There are those who support the things that Chavez has done, and also that the current president is trying to do. But there are also people inside Venezuela who very much oppose them. These people tend to look to the United States for help in their attempt to change the government. So depending on who you ask, you're going to have very different answers. So I suspect that in this study, they may have asked quite a few people who are against Chavez and against Maduro, and who look for the United States for help. And it would be quite natural for those people to don't see the United States as a threat to their political system. They actually want the United States to help them overthrow or change their current government. And it does make sense for those people to perhaps be more concerned about China. So I think that might be a good explanation why Venezuela is the only red country, despite its long history of US intervention in its political system. Now finally, if we move to Europe, and this is again perhaps the biggest surprise, although the Western media has been putting out this story about democracies versus dictatorships and about how China is trying to expand its authoritarian model all around the world, including in Europe. Despite this story that we've been hearing about for the last several years, most people in Europe still consider the United States to be the main threat to their democratic system. The only exceptions are, in this study, Hungary, which considers China to be the main threat, and Italy. Well, there's one other way to look at the results of this study, though, and this helps to explain this European map. That is to look at the difference between how concerned people are about China and how much people are concerned with the United States. So now you see a lot of colors changing, and blue still means that people in this country consider the United States to be the main threat to their democratic system or to their political system. Green means that these countries also consider the United States to be the main threat, but just a little bit less. While yellow means that countries consider the United States and China to be around equal threats. You know, some of them may edge towards China, others may edge towards the United States, but overall they consider them to be equal threats. Now, if we zoom out and look at the world at large, what you can see that Europe is mostly yellow, which means that they are kind of split. They consider US and China to be about equal threats. You also actually see that a lot of Southeast Asia is yellow, although they're all, except for the ones that we discussed, kind of edging towards seeing the United States as the main threat, you know, except for Australia and Vietnam, who is actually orange here, and Malaysia and the island of Taiwan. But this is another way to look at the map, and it does show that there's only one country that is very concerned about China's influence in its democratic system, that is the United States. Then there are two countries that are orange, so they also are relatively more concerned about China than about the United States. There's quite a few yellow, which means that, well, although most of them are edging towards seeing the United States as the main threat, especially in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, most of them, the difference is not all that big. But there is still quite a lot of green, which means that those countries do think the United States to be, with some margin, to be the bigger threat to their democratic system. So there you have it. I think these studies are very important because what politicians tell us should always be taken with a lot of skepticism. And especially when politicians try to justify a war, or when they try to get their people to support a war, it's often being done based on false or misleading information. So the current story that US leaders and also European leaders are trying to sell to the world is that China is this big threat to democracy, and that the world, countries in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East and Asia, that all these countries are looking to the United States for protection, to protect their political system against a expanding and increasing Chinese authoritarianism. Well, that's the story that politicians tell us, but if you look at studies that actually investigate this, what you'll find may be very different, and in this case I think is very different. So thank you for listening, and see you next time.